Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. We are radical feminists and the targeted opponents of gender identity proponents. Our analysis of gender identity ideology has been consistent since Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire in 1979. For 46 years. So we were not surprised when this new attack on women came along, and we have not changed our analysis. In 2018, we wrote a declaration on women's sex-based rights, which lays out our position, and it has been signed by nearly 40,000 people from 160 countries and is supported by 542 organizations around the world. We have volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent. Please join us. You can also become a member of WDI to help our work by volunteering or donating. Contact info@womensdeclaration.com or via your country contact on the website at womensdeclaration.com. Our program today will start with Elena Armesto from Spain. Elena has a degree in audiovisual communication and a master's in advertising and marketing. She will be talking about the trans business. Next, we'll hear from Christy Hammer in the US. Christy is an associate professor of sociology and education and an instructor of women and gender studies at the University of Southern Maine. She'll be talking about sex realism and its enemies in higher education. Then we'll hear from Rej Cluett from the UK and Ruth Lewis, also in the UK. Rej has worked within breastfeeding support for nearly 20 years. She volunteered as a breastfeeding counselor with La Leche League GB for 14 years and as a trustee of the charity for 1 year before being removed for sticking up for single-sex spaces and keeping La Leche League groups mother-only. Ruth will be presenting with her. Ruth was a volunteer breastfeeding counselor for La Leche League for 17 years and a trustee with La Leche League GB before also being kicked out for trying to hold the line and maintain single-sex mother-to-mother support in the charity. She's also a Philia volunteer and a freelance proofreader and editor. And then we'll have Q&A, and if there's time, we'll hear news from Canada, New Zealand, and the US. So for now, I will turn it over to Elena. Welcome, Elena.
We all know that the trans is supported by a big industries and corporation, and behind of this trend that is lasting more than 20 years, I would say, it's a lot of money. So as Jennifer Bailey says, if you follow the money, you will find everything supporting this industry. As said, the trans business, trans rights are market rights. I mean, everything behind, as I was saying before, is a matter of money. In the late decades, we have seen how the new procedures, new treatments have been being developed, have been launched, and this has a reason, is to gain money to these corporations that we were working on. And yes, as said, the gender identity industry is a very profitable business, especially surgeries and prostheses, hormones, and other drugs to counteract the diseases caused by the hormones, sperm ovary freezing, surrogation, even for those that have been castrated by those surgeries or drugs. And the list goes on and on and on and on. And they are very expensive, and they give a lot of revenue to the corporations manufacturing or supplying with these treatments. The more our health has been improving during the last decades, the more the pharma and the medical device industry has been developing new go-to-market strategies in order to keep the levels of profitability. In the 60s, 80s, they introduced in the market a lot of different pills and drugs, such as stimulants, amphetamines, Ritalin, you know Ritalin, antidepressants, oxycodone, and all the other treatments like the cosmetic surgery ones. But in this century, given that the market was more or less established, the pharma and the medical device industry had to take to other ways of keeping growing. So they opened the market to the children mainly, and then introducing all these drugs and others into our kids. Puberty blocker and sex growth hormone. If you take a look to the different levels of growth of both stimulants and opioids, comparing with the sex block hormones and the cross-sex hormones, you will see the same pattern. The more is our health improving, the more they are introducing new procedures or new drugs. So I said, how to further expand the market? By expanding the portfolio of the medical procedures. This is easy. So you can buy yourself a life, buy yourself a job, buy yourself a baby, buy yourself a whole body, and if needed, you can find and buy your own identity. That's the reason, because we are seeing from the pansexual thing, the agenda thing, the non-binary, and all this kind of bullshit that we are listening every day, every day. It was a very good campaign. I said good because I usually study this stuff. And 5-6 years ago, MasterCard for forsake, launched a campaign called True Name, because they foreseen that it was a very good niche for the trans and non-binary users. So they launched a business, a credit card where trans and non-binary consumer can put their real name. So that kind of advertising give us a clue about what is happening. This is not a matter of making people feel better, but about getting their money. According to this, and there is a very interesting documentary film named The Bleeding Edge by Amy Searing and Kirby Dick. You can see it in Netflix, I think, actually, where they talk about not the pharma industry, but the medical device industry. Actually, this industry, the medical device industry, is even more bigger than the pharma one. The CEO of the association of this industry in the States, AdvaMed, said that they have more power than some governments in Europe. That's nuts. I mean, they can make more money than countries in Europe. They have a lot of power. And I'm not talking about the pharma industry again. I'm talking about the medical device industry, which are the corporations manufacturing lights for the surgery rooms, or bandage, or even scalpers. So this kind of industry is getting a lot of money because of the trans surgeries and other procedures. So according to the latest research studies, this specific market will be worth $6 billion by 2030, with an estimated growing rate about 10%. If we take a look to the automotive industry, it is growing by 5%. And if you take a look to the mobile device industry, it is growing by 3.5%. So let's put the size on the business. It's huge. One of these most active members of this lobby, the AlphaMet, is Robin Lobo. Robin Lobo is the CEO of Stryker. I'm more than sure that you all know Stryker. Stryker is the corporation owning the Arcus Foundation, which is the largest social investor on trans issues. Stryker has been increasing their profits in the last decade because of investing via Arcus on create a good framework for their operations worldwide, priceless. That's it. I took this picture from the website of our colleagues in Spain, Contra el Borrado de las Mujeres, because they did a fantastic job investigating industries like Stryker. John Stryker is the founder and is the one also managing the Arcus Foundation, and is one of the largest donators on the so-called LGBTIQ plus blah 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 across US and Europe. From NGOs dedicated to lawsuit different cases to LGBTA local organizations, even other entities such as Transgender Europe. They are pushing very hard on this, and they succeed. Arcus has been also pushing a lot in order to introduce, as I said, very success initiatives on the different legislative bodies across Europe, not only on the supranational level, but only on the regional one. Arcus was promoting somehow to the Yogyakarta principles via Michael O'Flaherty, who is nowadays the director of the Fundamental Rights Agency in the European Union. And O'Flaherty, together with Victor Madrigal, they are usual speakers at the hundreds of events that Arcus is holding worldwide. So you can make an idea of how this working. It is a very endogamic board, led by men, by the way. And they are pushing in one hand all the legislation, and on the other side, putting new procedures and new products into the market to make their business. Arcus, founded by a Stryker Corporation, and together with other big moguls, such as the Open Society Foundation, or even the Pritzker family, you know who these guys are. And of course, Martin Rothblatt, they are putting lots of money in order to open the market to new products to sell. They are pushing the boundaries indeed, like Arcus says in its publicity. For those who call all of us like conspiracy theorists, just take a look to the numbers. Stryker made a lot of money, as said, in the last decade, but it has been also been strict because all these devices they are putting into the market. So when I've been told that I'm, trying to be very conspiracy theorist, I said, I mean, look, these people is manufacturing a lot of devices and they are being sued worldwide because they are not doing things okay. And some people in our countries, in our governments are telling us that really these people are good because they are putting money on these NGOs. I don't buy it. because they are making a lot of money of it. They are not working this for, charity stuff. They are working on that for being very profitable. And you have not only Stryker, you have Gilead, you have the Pritzker Corporation, you have Endo Pharmaceuticals, and you have even United Therapeutics, which is the company run by Martin Rothblatt. All of these guys are investing not only in products, but also in legislation in order to open the market to their activities. So it's clear, as you can see, their P&Ls and their revenues every day and every year. So the usual suspects, you have them there. Old man, white man, John Stryker, Jennifer Pritzker, Martin Black, and George Soros, among others. I mean, these are the most famous or the well-known in the trans industries. These people are putting a lot of money. I said, John Stryker via Arcus. Arcus, I would say that is the more diversified in terms of region around the globe in order to introduce the transgender identity theory. Jennifer Pritzker, who is more focused on the States, even opened a hospital in Chicago for transgender care. Then we have George Soros, or the Soros family, more like, and they are basically founding the Transgender Europe NGO in Europe, and they are doing a lot of fighting a lot in order to introduce transgender laws in every European countries. And we have Martin Rothblatt. Martin Rothblatt goes beyond the transgender thing. You know that this guy is a transhumanism himself. He cloned his wife, and he's running kind of religion. His son, who was a Democrat candidate, if I'm not wrong, is one of the pastor of this how it's called, the Terasem movement thing. And Martin Rothblatt was one of the first drafting what he called the transgender rights back in the 80s. And though he's keeping kind of a low profile, he's investing huge amounts of money in order to cross the boundaries of the human body, starting for himself, declaring himself as a woman, and investing in a lot of really transgressor medicine. I'm more than sure that you have heard about the big first transplants that were failed, but he's still pushing a lot, and he is very kind of an influencer. He can do whatever he wants in this sense, and trying to push the boundaries more than the transgender thing. So there they are, the usual suspects. They are moving, as said, like $6 billion US, and that's the reason that this nonsense is being so trend in the last decades. Thank you very much for listening to me.
We will move on to Christy, who will be talking about the sex realists in academia and their enemies. Welcome, Christy.
I think most people probably know what happened. I was teaching in a class and a student said I wasn't qualified after I answered her question that there's two sexes with variation. And it early had become compelled speech that I was asked at my university to state or at least believe in multiple sexes. And I taught beyond the binary for about 30 years, but what I hadn't realized, and I was on sabbatical for a year in 2018, when a lot of gender identity stuff I think was really growing on campus, then I mostly taught online. So come to the fall of 2020, I did not realize that there were mandatory pronouns, mandatory in some K-12 and college classes. I did not realize that the idea of the biology of sex was undermined. And indeed, teaching beyond the biology became, in certain non-science, non-biology fields, destroying the binary, undermining the binary. The binary doesn't exist. The binary is mystified. Who knows if there's a spectrum or not? And that really took hold in what I would call ideology over science in the university, and in a post-truth, anti-science, maybe postmodern way. What I was told by a geneticist at my university after I contacted him and had a brief lunch with him, he said, biologists don't want to talk about gender any more than non-biology profs, the humanities, social scientists want to talk about the binary. And I really thought that pretty much clarified it all. You know, the anthropologist C.P. Snow talked about two cultures, you know, that there was the science and the non-science view of reality. And I think this denial of sex has really cleaved through those two cultures, certainly in the university. After I said there were two sexes with variation, and the university removed me from my class and had a horrible restorative justice event where I was supposed to admit to multiple sexes, what the university responded with was to put on a workshop beyond the binary, where it was just with trans rights activists, which I support trans rights activists, but they didn't have a biologist. They didn't have anybody with any science background. And this was to, you know, heal the university that was hurt by hearing a professor said there two sexes existed. And at this workshop that the president and the DEI person that ran the bad restorative justice was at, people said things without question. Nobody questioned it, that doctors open the legs of babies and guess at birth, and that the binary was a colonial factor of colonial conquest that was brought across the pond and imposed on, you know, maybe androgynous, I'm not sure, indigenous people. So these are things that were said and were not, nobody said that there are actually two sexes with variation. A philosopher, someone who went to Harvard in biology of philosophy, she said, did anybody ever tell these few students that you were right, that two sexes with variation? It is really remarkable. 5 years ago, the National Institute for Health had to put out an article for researchers. Basically, it was an article that begged researchers not to, this was before the self-ID movement in science, which has certainly undermined science validity. But their article was two sex forms and multiple genders. This is how we deal in society with this multiplicity of genders, but there's two sex forms. One of my Cheyenne, Wyoming high school buddies was a biochemist, PhD at National Institute for Health. And he said how, you know, he was involved as a Hispanic in the essentialism of race, and how, you know, race self-ID was what you should do in biomedical research. But he didn't realize how crazy it was going to get with gender. And the idea that gender is as socially constructed as race is ridiculous, but that's a very common view now. He just retired from the National Institute of Health along with his boss. He told me his boss said in a top-level National Institute of Health meeting, now I identify as a Springbok. So, you know, what are we gonna, wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall? And they both retired, which was probably a good thing. So I, as a longtime hard left sociologist, women and gender studies, as a more empirical, historical view of women and gender studies, I did not realize what the craziness with gender on campus. I started studying very quickly. Anne Minash from FIST, Feminist and Struggle, really found me. And when she was telling me about the erasure of sex, you know, I looked at the phone, I thought, oh, this conspiracy, crazy. I was about halfway reading Kara Dansky's The Erasure of Sex before I realized, oh my God, she's a TERF. So this was all very new to me. but I've attended a couple wonderful gender critical meetings. I do agree that probably sex realism is the better phrase overall. What happened with Title IX is absolutely ridiculous. The entire decade of the 90s, I was the Title IX consultant for the state of New Hampshire. We were trained by lawyers at the office, from the Office of Civil Rights. I'd love for Kara to respond to this. We were trained to go after behavior, not belief. We were told, you talking with the school principal, he might be racist as heck, but if it's his beliefs, we go after behavior. You have to behave in a way that comports with the civil rights law and protected categories. And I think that is what has changed. That kind of analysis that it might be behavior in civil rights, but it's belief, and the whole thought police kind of analysis. I also think an issue that's happened is the Gen X students. Now I'm approaching retirement age, so you can just say I'm an old fart, which I am. But what I've realized is that students now identify personal identity with social justice. This is kind of confusing in a hyper-individualistic society. I suppose we should have expected it. Someone said, I thought this was brilliant, and after George Floyd was killed in 2000, social justice warriors wanted to change the society, and they couldn't, and they weren't able to, right? It was still racist, but what they could do is go after people in the workplace that use the wrong pronoun. And so they became these little social justice warriors, kind of a gotcha issue, I realized, that pronouns had become.
Have you gotten any support in academia? And if so, what did that support look like?
It's really been crickets, even though hundreds of people asked the university to support me. Jennifer Gingrich did a change.org petition. Over 4,000 people signed it saying universities must support sex realism. And there's been absolutely nothing. And in fact, there's been retaliation. I got moved to the lowest level classes, and many professors are very worried about this issue, and they do believe that the binary somehow is automatically transphobic. I'm not really sure why that's happened. I'd like to say a very similar issue. Here's some good news. I don't know what my university is going to do, but I just heard from a biology professor. Dozens of biology professors contacted me around the world here saying that they were canceled for teaching their subject. In Auckland, Australia, an education professor was told by their administration to write an apology letter to a student that they'd offended by saying two sexes exist. And this was in the paper. And recently I heard from this biology person in Auckland, New Zealand, excuse me, that they've backed off on that, and now the university might apologize to the professor.
So for that, let's turn to Rej and Ruth, who are going to tell us what on earth is going on with La Leche League. Welcome, Rej and Ruth.
Just very briefly, for those of you who don't know what LLL, La Leche League, is, it was set up in 1958 as a mother-to-mother breastfeeding support organisation. It started very locally in order to offer breastfeeding support to other local mums, and the need for it at that time was such that it grew exponentially to become an international organisation with chapters all around the world. It went from just local meetings answering each other's questions and supporting each other to a booklet and then a book, The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding, the latest edition of which they've dropped the womanly. It's always been a quietly radical organisation, set up at a time when doctor's word was pretty much everything, and formula was seen as the scientific and therefore better thing to do. Yeah, it used to be evidence-based, not so much anymore. So that's very, very brief overview of what LLL was set up as, at least.
Yeah, it went from this very mother-centered, woman-centered group to, there was a bit of a takeover by stealth, really, of LLLI, which is the international sort of overboard, I suppose. We really first saw it in around 2014 where there started to be changes to language and to certain prerequisites of becoming a leader, which is what we call, or what LLL call their breastfeeding counsellors, their leaders, to accommodate Trevor, who was a trans man in Canada, who first started attending groups and then decided that she wanted to become a LLH League leader. So we saw this beginning in changing, and then more recently they started to introduce this approach of using a variety of terms. So things like breastfeeding and chest feeding, or body feeding, or human milk feeding, or mothers and families, or mothers and lactating parents, or whatever the latest term was. And this came with various repeated assurances that, you know, nobody wants to erase the word mother, but and it all comes from a really good place, I'm pretty sure, but it comes with various risks, including making it a lot harder to understand, for example, the written materials and the advice. It's an issue for anyone. I mean, if you're a sleep deprived new mum, it's hard enough to take anything on board, let alone if it's written in sort of gender neutral, additive gobbledygook. But it really has an impact, a massive impact, on women with learning disabilities or low literacy levels, or English as a second language, for example. And my experience has been that the variety of terms often comes at the expense of the word mother. You tend to find it gets dropped. So you talk about lots of, you know, breastfeeding families. In my experience, I was the only one getting up in the middle of the night to breastfeed my babies. But there we go. We also saw a lot of duplicity around the term male lactation. Marion Thompson, who is one of the last two living founding mothers, who resigned last year, I think October, November, quite publicly. She sought assurance about male lactation and was told that LLL does not support male lactation and that leaders are not required to support males to lactate. But, you know, the LLI website completely contradicts this. In fact, there's a whole page dedicated to trans and non-binary breastfeeding, stating that LLL supports trans men, trans women, and non-binary people. And they also introduced an inclusion statement, which is very, very open to interpretation. I know that I felt I was able to carry on as an LLL leader despite being a sex realist, but obviously other people feel differently. But the really key thing to that inclusion statement is it misses the point that there is a difference between providing breastfeeding information to everyone, because that can include supporting the breastfeeding mother. And that's very different to offering breastfeeding support to everyone. So that's the international overview.
LLH GB is in quite a helpful, we thought, position as being an independent charity in the UK, which means that it's answerable to the Charity Commission here, and that means something in terms of what trustees' obligations and responsibilities are. So what we saw happening in the UK was very similar to what was going on in international in terms of additive language, making things unclear, but also any attempts to talk about what was happening with language was shut down. We were told that we were harmful if we suggested there might be a difference between biological men and biological women. And not last summer, the summer before, I stepped down as the editor of Breastfeeding Matters, which was the members magazine, over the language issue. And then in the autumn, a group of us decided to stand for election to the Council of Directors. And we were successful, which meant that the board was around about 50-50 in terms of those who thought that inclusion meant including everyone in everything, and those of us who thought there's a little bit of a difference between male and female. So one of the things that we knew as directors in LLLGB was that the charitable objects and the beneficiaries of LLLGB as a UK charity were helpful, we believed, because the beneficiaries are mothers and babies, and in UK law the word mother, there is no ambiguity, and it is exactly what you would think it would mean. Whereas, as we know, with what's been going on in the Supreme Court, that's not the case for women. So the fact that our beneficiaries are mothers was very helpful. And we believed that the conflict between the inclusion policy that LLL International was telling us we had to introduce and the GB charitable objects was a problem that needed to be addressed. However, when we tried to do this, what we found was the Orwellian situation of the policy of inclusion being used against us when we tried to talk about that very policy, because it was so harmful to suggest that there was a difference. We ended up in a very convoluted year. We had complaints about us from our fellow trustees to the international board, who eventually suspended us because we shared communications between one of our trustees and the international board, which asked questions and raised concerns. We shared that with all of the GB leaders. We were suspended as a result of that. We raised a serious incident report to the Charity Commission and spoke to the press. That was used as an excuse to try and get rid of us through resolutions at an extraordinary general meeting. That failed. The international board then decided that since we'd spoken to the press and had apparently disparaged LLL International or La Leche League by suggesting that there was a conflict between the charitable objects and the inclusion policy, the complaint against us was changed. So it was no longer about having shared information. It was now about having spoken to the press. At the same time all of this was going on, we sought a legal opinion from a top KC in the UK, Aqua Rheindorf, which confirmed what we said, basically, that there was a conflict and that it would be unlawful for leaders in GB to support males with lactation. Despite knowing this, La Leche League International removed our accreditation as La Leche League leaders. I wrote in an email to them at the very end of the process when we were told that we could remain as leaders if we agreed to the policy of inclusion. I wrote in an email to them, can I just check that you're saying that in order to keep my accreditation as a leader, I need to agree to a policy that we now know is unlawful? And they said, yes, that's right. So a group of us were disaccredited. That was then used against us as part of a campaign when it came to re-election to the Council of Directors in GB come November. So now there's nobody willing to speak up about it within La Leche League GB. So they're in a position where they still can't legally follow the inclusion policy, but we're not entirely sure what's going to be happening there.
I mean, obviously many mothers choose not to breastfeed or have issues breastfeeding, but we know that breastfeeding is good for babies and good for mums, and helps the health of mothers as well as babies. In fact, a study commissioned by UNICEF back in 2012 indicates even a slight increase in breastfeeding rates or duration of breastfeeding. Those mums who are already breastfeeding could save the NHS up to 40 million a year. And the NHS, by the way, is the National Health Service. It's our free at point of use health service over here in the UK, because I've suddenly realised there are lots of people who aren't here. So breastfeeding, we know, it can be a protective factor against diabetes and cardiovascular disease in mothers and babies. The reduction in, for example, female cancers, so ovarian cancer. I'd love to see a trans woman who has a reduction in ovarian cancer because they breastfed their baby. And also premenopausal breast cancer is, the risk is greatly reduced. So we know that breastfeeding can be very important in terms of health. But the language around it also really matters. It matters in the research, and it matters in how the information comes out. So one really good example of that is safe sleeps with bed sharing. Breastfeeding is one of the protective factors if you want to safely bed share with your baby. And as soon as you start to introduce terms about parents or chest feeding and not specifying that it's actually at the breast feeding, not bottle feeding pumped milk or feeding through an SNS, for example, it just twists the meaning and can make something that is safe unsafe. It's also things like obesity. So breastfeeding can have a protective effect against overweight in later life, and it's the method of feeding, not the substance fed, that makes the difference. So a baby who is bottle fed expressed milk, and I mean, hats off to mums who manage to express and feed exclusively that way, that still has that ramification later on down the line. But the other thing about changing the language in this way is it removes the mother from the equation. It dismisses the importance of the mother-baby dyad and diminishes the mother's role. The other issue is that taking the baby away, taking away that mother-baby dyad and reducing the importance of that, and introducing, say, a trans woman feeding pumped milk or formula through an SNS, you are then potentially irretrievably damaging that breastfeeding relationship with mum, with all those benefits conferred on mum and baby, in the quest of a man or a male person, however they identify, in their quest to have some kind of pseudo breastfeeding experience. So it's just a real danger, and I think that is sometimes lost or minimized when we're talking about this. So and those safeguarding risks go further than that. So I don't know if you want to say something about that, Ruth.
One of the things that we were trying to deal with as trustees is to talk about the safeguarding policy within La Leche League GB, and it was the absolute refusal to have the conversation that a male wanting to breastfeed was in any way a safeguarding issue, which was one of the most disturbing things that we experienced during our time as trustees, I would say. So there's quite a lot that is raised, or it's spoken about what the milk is made up of in a male who lactates, and that is an issue, but I think personally it's a distraction from the much bigger safeguarding issue of the fact that a male wants to breastfeed a baby. It's at best a man wanting to breastfeed, maybe because it's about bonding with the baby. That's the most benign reason there could possibly be. But as Rej said, that will be a disruption to the breastfeeding dyad, which would mean that successful breastfeeding of that baby and mother, their relationship, far, far less likely. Less benign reasons for a male to want to breastfeed is to use that baby as a tool in order to affirm an identity, which is abusive. And of course, there's also the absolute appalling and very, very disturbing idea that, and we know that there is the case that there are men out there who have a fetish, a lactation fetish. So there it's much, much clearer abuse. And it's just something that seems to be swept under the carpet, with the idea that, well, we'd know if it was someone who didn't have the best of intentions. It's just a fetish, and there is no good reason to support a male to lactate, to feed a baby. As I said, the idea that the breast milk might be similar, or the milk that whatever is produced in male lactation might be similar, but even if it was identical and there was nothing in the milk that could harm the baby, and we don't know that that's the case, it's still not okay under any circumstances. So there's safeguarding issues of the baby and also of mothers. One of the wonderful things about breastfeeding support groups and LLL, when it does it right, which it still does on a local level in a lot of places, I think, is the inclusion of males in breastfeeding support groups. There's the idea that you could ask the mums whether they're okay with this bloke who thinks he's a woman or says he is joining a breastfeeding group. But as one of the leaders said recently in a podcast that we took part in, she would not put it on the mothers to make that decision. It's up to the volunteers to safeguard that space for women to talk about breastfeeding. And there are so many mothers who could not attend a support group where there were men there, whether that's for reasons of being subjected to male violence, sexual violence, domestic abuse, coercive control, or because of religious restrictions, or just because it's a really vulnerable time when you've just had a baby. It's just not okay on any level. And if we can't name what is going on, we can't do that protection of a really important space. And if you want to include trans women, you can't keep out any men, because either it's a single sex space or it's not. So then you could have the loveliest bloke in the world who's there, who just wants to support the mother of his child, but it means that the space is no longer a safe space to talk about breastfeeding without worrying about the dad's feelings, because men do want to give a bottle so that they can bond with the baby. And it's the prioritization of men's feelings over women's needs, which I'm fairly sure there's no one here who would think that that's a good plan. And it's also a question of safeguarding volunteers. We all know the statistics about what proportion of women have been subjected to male violence. Volunteers, and certainly all electorally breastfeeding counsellors are volunteers. They are just as likely to have been subjected to male violence as the mothers who come. So implementing or imposing an inclusion strategy, which is for everyone to come along to support meetings, takes away the ability of those women to put their own boundaries in place for themselves as well as for other women. And some meetings take place in homes, in leaders' homes. And it's not the same welcoming a bloke into your own personal space as it is to welcome other mothers. And finally, it's all about inclusion. That's what we were told, that we were anti-inclusion when we were trying to say, no, it's not okay to include males. Both Rej and I were told that we were very harmful around this. And when we talked about the inclusion of males leading to the exclusion of women who would exclude themselves for the reasons I've mentioned, we were told, well, people exclude for all sorts of reasons, which may well be true, but it's not okay to prioritise the wrong people. And as one of our other colleagues says, mother itself is an inclusion strategy, which we very firmly believe. So, and Rej is going to tell you a little bit about what's next for us, given that we've all been booted out of Rej League, both as breastfeeding counsellors and trustees. We are no longer have any affiliation to it.
Yeah, so what next? We are setting up a new organisation. We are
in the UK.
growing in the UK. Yeah, sadly not international yet, but we are taking inspiration from the original mission of LLL and the whole philosophy and the concept statements. It does take time though. We are, progress is good, but it does take time. And we also really want it to be sustainable and for the growth of it to be organic. So we're going to take it slowly, within reason. But yeah, watch this space. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to getting back to just supporting mums and not having all this politics and pandering to men, frankly. So all really positive for the future, I think.
Hello from Canada. In Canadian news this week, a Winnipeg man has been arrested and charged with voyeurism after he was caught snapping photos of a 10-year-old girl undressing in a gender-neutral changing room at a Grant Park fitness facility. The man was in the cubicle next to the girl whose father caught him snapping photos. Her father notified the staff, who called the police. According to police, he was later released on a court order prohibiting him from contacting individuals under the age of 16 in public spaces such as parks, playgrounds, or schools until a judge decides otherwise. Police have seized the man's phone and are in the process of getting a warrant to search the device for any evidence. This is yet another example of our government refusing to provide adequate protection for women and girls from men and insisting that gender-neutral changing facilities are fair and safe for everyone. We all know they're not. CEDAW will be hosting their second annual reality-based Women Unite event on International Women's Day, March 8th in Calgary. This is the biggest event of the year for gender-critical women in Canada. The speakers list includes Amy Ham, Heather Mason, Drea Humphrey, Maureen Sullivan, Ghislaine Gendron, and Kara Dansky. I attended this event in Toronto last year, and it truly was an incredible experience. If you'd like to go, you can visit the CEDAW website or their Twitter page to purchase tickets. Finally, last Monday, Justin Trudeau announced his resignation. Well, this outcome wasn't what most Canadians were hoping for. We wanted an election. There are some benefits to a prorogued parliament. Canadian TERFs have been deeply concerned about Bill C-63 passing, which would have threatened us with jail time for simply stating the truth. That bill, along with any others that were in the works, is dead. It's died along with Justin Trudeau's resignation. So that is certainly something to celebrate. And that's all I have for you from Canada today. Thank you.
Hi, this is Janet reporting from New Zealand. A big event that's coming up soon is the deadline for the report for submissions about puberty blockers to the Ministry of Health. They're wanting to know whether people think that they should put some restrictions onto the use of puberty blockers for young people with gender issues. So that's due in quite soon, in about a week, less than a week now. It's a strange website place where you can submit, but because they don't even ask who anyone is or any contact details, but you can also email them. Now, there have been some media reports ongoing about the puberty blockers. There's been a very good article from Resist Gender Education saying puberty blockers are human wrong. They cite the Cass report and other sources about the harms of puberty blockers. They say there are 4 simple facts. Humans cannot change sex. Puberty is natural and a necessary developmental stage. Children do not have the cognitive ability to make life-changing decisions. And lastly, misleading children about these things is child abuse. So they say the Ministry of Health should stop elevating the lived experience, in quotes, of those who hold an unevidenced belief in gendered souls and start following the very clear international evidence against the use of puberty blockers for the purpose of bypassing natural development. And then there's an article in the New Zealand Herald, which is the biggest sort of Auckland region mainstream newspaper in the country, who've been, like all the mainstream press, very anti anything that might look gender critical, but they appear to be changing their approach on puberty blockers. This was an article by Professor Charlotte Paul, who has actually been one of the few voices right from the start who's been questioning the widespread use of puberty blockers in New Zealand. So the 3 key facts in her article, which the Herald emphasises, are new prescribing of puberty blockers for Kiwi children has increased 7-fold over 15 years. The Ministry of Health's evidence brief states there is insufficient basis to claim puberty blockers are safe or reversible, and many Europeans have stopped the routine use of the puberty blockers. And that's a very well written article by Charlotte Paul, which I will put in the in the chat. And in response to that, an activist, a gender critical lesbian activist from Wellington, sent in a letter congratulating them on that article, and they actually highlighted that as the letter of the week. And then they also published a letter from Peter Davis, who is the husband of the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, and he's also saying that there should be more restrictions on puberty blockers and we should follow medical information and facts about that. And now, as far as sport goes, it appears that the Minister of Sport is finally shifting his position. There was actually a coalition agreement between the National Party and New Zealand First that there should be single-sex spaces in sport, in New Zealand sport, in community sport, if the community organisations want to get any funding from the government. So despite this being the coalition agreement, after the election, the Minister of Sport, Chris Bishop, has been really dragging his heels over it, and he has been quite influenced by Sport New Zealand, who have a transgender, very strong sort of transgender inclusion policy. But he's finally now saying, told that Sports New Zealand, he said that they must review their principles, or they should review their principles for transgender inclusion. Yeah, it's reported in the New Zealand Herald saying Sports Minister Chris Bishop told Sport New Zealand to review its principles for transgender inclusion after his hands-off approach triggered a deluge of feedback from national voters threatening to vote elsewhere. So that's good news. And I think the Ministry of Health holding seems to be good news, but they've at least admitted that the CAS report is right and that puberty blockers are not proven to be safe and effective. But we really don't know exactly what the Ministry of Health is going to do. So we just have to see what happens after the submissions. Thank you.
I'll start off with the biggest news of the week. Title IX is back, baby. In a huge win for women and girls, on Thursday, a federal court struck down the Biden administration's Title IX rewrite equating sex with gender identity nationwide, ruling that the new regulations, and I quote here, exceed the department's authority under Title IX, violate the Constitution, and are the result of arbitrary and capricious agency action. And quoting from the commentary we published following the January 9 ruling, the court also reminded the administration that the Supreme Court's 2020 Bostock decision that protected transgender people in the workplace does not apply to education or any arena beyond employment. And in case you're wondering why the ruling of a single federal district court applies nationwide, it is because the court vacated the final April 2024 rule in its entirety. And while the ruling is appealable, that's unlikely to happen given that the administration will be changing hands in less than 2 weeks. Nonetheless, this ruling is cause for celebration. Sex is once again real for all Title IX purposes, schools and sports, which is excellent news for women and girls as a sex class. Next, WDI USA is proud to announce the launch of our new anti-pornography working group. I'm pleased to report that the group published its first statement on the topic this past week. The statement cites Declaration Articles 1, 8, and 9, and is incredibly well resourced. Please give it a review. With state legislatures back in session, our SLA team issued a call to action requesting volunteer assistance to help track the introduction of new bills protecting the sex-based rights of women and girls using the tools provided at legiscan.com. Any relevant bills can then be forwarded to our info@womensdeclaration-usa.com email address, where they will be reviewed and subsequently forwarded on to the SLA team. We also issued a call to action asking signatories to call Democratic Reps Tom Suozzi and Seth Moulton and urge them to vote yes on HR 28, the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, a bill that would bolster Title IX by explicitly protecting women and girls in athletics. Originally passed in the House in 2023 without the support of a single Democrat, but never brought to a vote in the Senate, the bill has since been reintroduced in the new session, with the House vote expected this afternoon following a debate that was particularly cringeworthy. If you recall, after Kamala Harris lost the 2024 presidential election, Rep. Suozzi and Moulton both made sensible statements encouraging the Democratic Party to have open discussions about the unfairness of allowing male athletes to participate in sports designated for women and girls. I know that Kara has been closely following the vote, and I expect her to join us here with an update. WDI USA also signed on to 2 demand letters as part of the Our Bodies, Our Sports Coalition, both issued on January 9. The first letter, addressed to President Charlie Baker and members of the NCAA Board of Governors, requests a meeting with the board during the org's convention in Nashville to discuss the unjust and unfair consequences of current NCAA policies. The letter also renews the coalition's demands to 1, repeal all policies that allow males to compete in women's events, 2, establish and enforce the right of female athletes to participate in sports based on sex, 3, revoke any all records set by male athletes competing in the female category, and 4, require NCAA member institutions to provide single-sex locker rooms for female athletes. The second letter calls upon President-elect Trump to demand the NCAA change its policies to keep women's collegiate sports females and issues the same series of demands. And finally, we are saddened to hear of the death of volunteer Brandy Kochen, aka Runaway Siren 940 on YouTube, at the age of 23, apparently as a result of complications arising from mismanagement of her type 1 diabetes, as a family member described it in a fundraising appeal. Brandy was a former member of our lesbian caucus who also assisted us on video projects. As one board member put it, she was so young and alive and seemingly fearless. Rest in peace, Brandy, and know that you will be missed. That's all I have today. Thank you.